The waves crash ashore a tropical Caribbean island. The sand is soft and golden, the water crystal clear, gleaming in the shimmers of sunlight. The water hides the sea's mysteries and stories far beneath the waves. Though the sound of the waves are accompanied by the noticeable roar of jet engines, the distant whining of airplanes growing louder as they approach, passing just meters overhead. The Caribbean island of St. Maarten is a unique place. Not only is the island shared between two European nations that otherwise would not share a border, but the island is also served by one of the most interesting airports in the entire world. Princess Juliana International Airport has for the longest time sustained quite the reputation for its low flybys over the beach, nearby to the foot of the runway. Situated geographically in the west of the island on the Dutch side, this runway stares off into hillside to the east and the Caribbean Sea to the west. It is perhaps the most iconic approach in aviation today, as tourists are pulled from all over the world to gaze at passenger planes coming within meters overhead, whilst also enjoying the lovely warm weather and beautiful beaches of the Caribbean. However, the weather itself does have a tendency here to be unkind from time to time. The chaotic weather of the tropics can be a problem for pilots trying to land here. You can stand on that beach, staring off into the Caribbean Sea, and only wonder what stories it holds. Well, this is one of them. In 1970, the crew of a Douglas DC-9 struggled in awful stormy weather trying to land at St. Maarten. They tried again, and again, but were no closer to the safety of a runway. Out of options, they turn out over the sea, making a break for the next nearest airport. But that they couldn't quite make. Let's rewind, for you see, my viewer, to begin with this tale, we must travel back to 1970. New York City, Saturday, May 2nd, 1970. It's sunrise and the city's airports are bustling with travelers. New York's Kennedy Airport is no different. A very particular plane has arrived at the airport this morning. It's a Douglas DC-9 aircraft, registered as November 935 Foxtrot. The plane is owned by an American company known at the time as Overseas National Airways. Going forward, this will be shortened to ONA. They had only acquired this DC-9 the previous year, and this subvariant, a DC-933, has the longest range of any DC-9 around. At the time, the DC-9 was an aircraft that was proving to be extremely popular among airlines globally, as a powerhouse in the regional market. The New York-based airline, founded in the 1940s, found success offering charter services for other air carriers who needed planes. The company wasn't always stable financially, but in 1970, they had extended their charter services to the Caribbean offshoot of the Dutch national airline, KLM. That would be ALM, Antillian Airlines. KLM had set up the airline with hubs in the Dutch Caribbean colonies to service as a hub for the Americas. Their planes even looked a lot like those belonging to KLM in Europe. KLM by the late 1960s had sold most of their stake in the ALM company, which was handed over to the Antillian government, who then contracted with other carriers to establish a connection between the Caribbean island of St. Maarten and New York. Now, ALM did have a fleet of planes of their own, but none that could fly direct to New York. To navigate this, they reached out to other carriers for help finding a plane. Among them was Braniff International via use of a Boeing 727, a perfectly reasonable aircraft of the era to do the flight. However, ONA was considered chartering their DC-933. Though the DC-9 can perform this route non-stop, it was pretty much at the limit of its range capability. Headwinds or overloading of the plane or some other condition would necessitate a stopover en route, and Bermuda was conveniently on the flight path. To help navigate this arrangement, ONA had scheduled the installation of an auxiliary fuel tank to increase its flying time and range earlier in the year, but by the time of the accident, this work had still not been completed. Nevertheless, this DC-9, named the Carib Queen, was chosen for Flight 980, the New York to St. Maarten route. As part of the charter agreement between ONA and ALM, flight crews and the plane itself would, of course, be provided by ONA, whilst flight attendants were supplied by ALM. Introducing our flight crew for the journey. Let's meet Captain Balsey DeWitt, age 37. A former United Airlines captain, he had achieved 12,000 flight hours. The CEO of ONA himself offered Balsey a job as the chief pilot of their DC-9 fleet, where he developed a tough reputation as a pilot examiner. The captain had been flying the plane for about a year by the time of the accident. 25-year-old First Officer Harry Evans had 3,500 flight hours to his name, and had completed his final proficiency check on the DC-9 only 2 weeks before the accident. The two men were joined by a third member of crew, a navigator by the name of Hugh Hart, age 35. He had little experience in the DC-9, instead gaining hours in ONA's DC-8 fleet. The navigator role is long antiquated today, and even an aircraft like the DC-9 can be flown with just 2 crew members. ONA and other carriers were already in the process of phasing out navigator roles. Captain DeWitt turned up for work where he found that the company had placed a notice regarding fuel on the New York to St. Maarten route. It emphasized that estimated fuel on arrival, the EFA, should be a minimum of 7,000 pounds of remaining fuel, or 3,175 kilograms. This 7,000 pounds estimated fuel on arrival figure is to comply with rules and regulations surrounding fuel carriage. Not only should a plane carry enough fuel for the intended trip, referred to in this case as their en route fuel, but there should also be enough to make it to an alternate, of which, to be fair, there is no shortage of in the Caribbean. Every island here has an airport to some degree, and also a little extra in reserve. 10% of their en route fuel to account for taxiing, APU usage, and just a little extra for extra flying time to keep within margins for safety. This amounts to a total fuel value that pilots call their block fuel. So this notice the flight received required that if the fuel used en route to St. Maarten was thought to be less than the 7,000 pounds minimum, the flight should make an intermediate stopover. Captain DeWitt and the flight crew did the calculations and briefing with an estimated fuel load of 28,000 pounds, or 12.7 tons in metric. This should give them a total flying time of 4 hours and 34 minutes. Going forward, we will be using pounds as the measurement for fuel, as this was what was used by the American crew members, though metric conversions will be supplied in video. To be exact, when the fuel loading was complete at 10:15 that morning, 28,900 pounds of fuel had been loaded. According to fuel gauges on the aircraft and on the ground, it was a full tank. This, of course, brought the plane above the 7,000 EFA minimum, meaning this would be a direct flight for the DC-9 all the way down to the Caribbean. Now, as events played out throughout the day of May 2nd, 1970, the fuel situation would evolve into a critical state the pilots would struggle to control, ultimately winding up in disaster. Diving deeper into the flight plan, the flight crew would recognize an alternate arrival airport about 110 miles away on the island of St. Thomas. With an expected cruising altitude of 29,000 feet, or flight level 290, the journey to St. Maarten was expected to be around 3 hours and 26 minutes, but this does not include the extra hour of flying time afforded by the extra fuel. By all metrics, this should have been more than enough fuel to get them there, but also to get them out if things go wrong. On the ground in New York, Captain DeWitt boards the plane, where he discovers that though minor maintenance write-ups had been signed off, he finds that the public address system between the cockpit and cabin was inoperative. Aside from this, there were no other faults with the plane from what we can tell. The captain checks the minimum equipment list to verify if the public address system was on it. The PA, it turns out, was under a category of equipment that could be inoperative for the flight, but would have to be fixed within a certain time frame. It is perhaps an annoyance to release the plane without it, but investigators would later discover the consequences of the lack of a sufficient PA. With boarding complete by 11 a.m., ALM Flight 980 departs the gate at 11:02, leaving Kennedy Airport at 11:14. "57 passengers and 6 crew members are on the plane, for a total of 63 souls on board. In the cabin are 3 flight attendants. the purser, Wilfred Spencer, and the two stewards, Tobias Cordero and Margaret Abraham. Captain Ballsy DeWitt and his crew turned the plane south, out of the Atlantic Ocean, bound for the Caribbean. Flight 980 climbs out over the sea to the expected flight level 290 cruising altitude. On autopilot, the DC-9 steadily makes its way south, soaring high in the sky. If this were any other day, this would have been a normal flight. It's been about an hour since the plane left New York. Flight 980 hits a pocket of turbulence, certainly indicative of what was to come, as there is troubling weather ahead. The flight crew amend their course, making deviations to avoid the worst of it whilst they can. The weather at St. Maarten was not looking great. The Caribbean was being battered by a storm. According to ancient weather data from the day, it appears that weather over the Caribbean had been influenced by a cooler low-pressure system that had been encroaching from the north on the warm Caribbean. This, manifesting in thunderstorms, accompanied by heavy rain showers, blustery winds, and reduced visibility down to just a few miles. It wasn't just St. Maarten that was like this. Much of the Caribbean was facing similar weather that day, as stations in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands had also reported the similar stormy, windy, rainy, low visibility weather. The skies were grey and rough, not exactly the ideal flying weather. Later in the day, Flight 980 would have to descend into this mess. The flight is about to pass Bermuda. Right now, Flight 980 is cruising at the expected airspeed of Mach 0.78 at 29,000 feet, flight level 290. Captain Ballsy DeWitt elects to reduce the speed to Mach 0.76. He rationalized this as a more optimal cruise speed for a long-distance flight. However, he also chooses to stay at flight level 290 for the time being. Now that the plane has burned off some fuel and become lighter, higher flight levels may have been available, but no climb would occur. In fact, the opposite was about to happen. Planes are naturally more fuel efficient at higher altitudes, where the air is thinner, less dense, with fewer air molecules for the plane to interact with. This means a reduction in drag, therefore not requiring as much thrust to overcome it, increasing fuel efficiency. And if there is one thing pilots love, it's efficiency. If they can save fuel or save the company a little extra cash, making for better economy of the flight, they'll try to do it. It reflects well on them as a pilot. At 1:25, the flight is experiencing more turbulence. They make a request to air traffic control for a lower cruise altitude in an effort to avoid it. This was approved and the crew executed 2 steps. Firstly, down to flight level 270, 27,000 feet, then 15 minutes later, down to flight level 250, 25,000 feet. Accompanying this lower altitude, Captain DeWitt reduces the airspeed again, down to Mach 0.72. These changes to the flight had some implications on the performance of the plane, in that the problem with this execution is that it was conducive to greater fuel consumption. The lower altitude brought with it a greater drag force. This would mean more thrust would be needed to overcome it. The accompanying reduction in the cruise speed down from their originally planned Mach 0.78 at flight level 290 down to 0.72 meant it was now taking longer for them to reach their destination and overcome any winds. This was a point made by the investigation, that the fuel situation was effectively mismanaged. The pilots had deviated from their plan in a way that burned more fuel. All procedures used were conducive to higher rates of fuel consumption than those originally planned. At 2:24, the captain would run a fuel check, where he calculated that the plane would now arrive in St. Maarten with 6,000 pounds of fuel remaining, now lower than the expected 7,000 pounds the flight plan and company demanded. However, this alone was not responsible for the outcome of the incident. This higher fuel consumption was nowhere near enough to waste all of the fuel en route to St. Maarten. We know the plane was loaded with more than an hour's worth of fuel in excess, so what happened here exactly? Well, while the meteorological aspects are important to the flight, this accident was heavily swayed by the flight crew response to the weather, and decisions to continue an untenable flight, let's just say. All the while, this underlying fuel condition is lurking in the background. Things are going to get messy, so strap in. As Flight 980 is on its descent, approaching St. Maarten from the north, the flight was in communication with the San Juan Enroute Traffic Control Center. The controller speaking to the flight advised the crew that the weather in St. Maarten had dropped below the minimums for landing. When we're talking about minimums, we're talking about a set of criteria, margins in the areas of visibility, cloud parameters, and so on, that have been laid out and approved for safe landings. If the minimums cannot be met, then holding or a diversion may be required. The DC-9 being an early jet plane, it was equipped with instrument landing capabilities with localizer and glide slope systems, so limited visibility and poor weather was not necessarily a deal breaker for the DC-9. Too bad Princess Juliana Airport doesn't have an instrument landing system. A lot of airports in 1970 still did not really have them either, so this in and of itself was not all that unusual. In 1970, pilots navigated to the airport on a non-precision approach by use of ADF equipment on board the aircraft and following the broadcast frequency of a non-directional beacon, or NDB, at the site of the airport. NDB stations aren't always at the airport themselves, or even necessarily lined up with the runway either. Flying overhead of the airport, the pilots must fly an outbound heading for a few miles, before turning onto final, making a shot for the runway, all whilst following the needle provided by the signal from the NDB. They were expected to arrive in from the west, onto what was at the time runway 09. The ADF, the automatic direction finder, simply points in the direction of the broadcast and can't provide any sort of altitude guidance, so Princess Juliana demanded weather minimums of at least 2 miles of visibility, a cloud-based minimum of 600 feet, and pilots must report the airport in sight. As you can imagine, the cumbersome nature of the NDB arrival complicates matters further in stormy conditions. It's a higher workload for the pilots to handle, especially so when we're talking about an airport like St. Maarten, where the arrival is always conducted out over the Caribbean Sea. In low visibility, over water, pilots may not have any ground reference points with only the waves to look at. As Flight 980 was informed that weather conditions had dropped below these minimums, they would need to divert. At 2:45, the decision was apparently made that they would divert to San Juan in Puerto Rico. I say apparently because, well, they didn't actually divert in the end. If they did follow through with the diversion, then the accident that followed probably would not have occurred. Here's the investigation's comments. Of particular interest are the events which followed the captain's initial decision to divert to San Juan, after being advised that St. Maarten weather conditions had gone below the approved minimums. If the flight had proceeded to San Juan, the accident obviously would not have happened. This is to say that the flight crew changed their minds about the diversion. At 2:51, the captain re-evaluated the fuel situation and established that, yeah, sure, they can turn back to St. Maarten and also arrive on stand with 4,400 pounds EFA. However, this decision came at the cost of more fuel. They had already set course away from St. Maarten. They would now have to backtrack that distance. Now, this undiverting decision could have come about for a few reasons. Flight 980 was for a short time passed on to the tower controller for St. Maarten, who informed them that there was an improvement in the weather that met the required minimums, 4 miles of visibility and a higher cloud base. The revised weather information is promising as to not scupper their plans. Additionally, this may have compounded against the natural interest of the pilots to finish their job and deliver passengers to their intended destination. Flight 980 returned to a course for St. Maarten, descending down to 2,500 feet of altitude. 3:08. The St. Maarten controller advised the crew of a visibility down to 2 to 3 miles, with a cloud base of just 800 feet. It's still within the minimums with rain showers on the approach path. There were some complications with this weather information though. It wasn't exactly true to what the flight crew was seeing. This weather was based on observations east of the airport, and not out west where the plane would actually be flying. In actuality, the weather out here was much worse. Rain showers made it difficult to see much of anything. Visibility was close to zero. The DC-9 levels off at 2,500. They only have about 30 minutes of fuel remaining, and they were yet to make their first approach attempt. Yes, first attempt, by the way. It is the opinion of investigators that the captain should have identified that the fuel situation was reaching critical levels, as by today's standards, their remaining fuel is already well below what would be considered a fuel emergency. At this point, the captain should have recognized that fuel margins had reached critical limits, and that a timely diversion to the alternate was necessary if there were any significant delays in landing. 3:18. The pilots execute an approach, making a shot for the runway. The flight crew configure the plane for landing. Flaps were extended to 25 degrees, the landing gear lowered, descending down to just 600 feet above the water. The pilots of Flight 980 eventually had the airport in sight. On this first approach, they didn't have time to align themselves properly with the runway. They were unstable, and a missed approach was executed on this turn. After missing the first approach, Captain Ballsy DeWitt performs a tight left-hand circling pattern with reference to the ground near the airport to try and reposition the aircraft for a second landing attempt. He circled the plane a total of 3 times, and though Captain DeWitt revealed to investigators that he had the airport in sight, it still may have been difficult to see much outside due to the heavy rain showers battering the windshield. Flight 980 comes in for a second landing attempt. They miss it again, having been unsuccessful in lining up with the runway. Captain DeWitt re-enters the holding pattern. Closing in on 3:30, a third landing attempt is made. They fly out, turn, and this time, Captain DeWitt does manage to line the plane up, but faced other complications in the form of an unstable approach, too high and too fast. Yet again, it was another missed approach. They have now expended 11 minutes of their remaining flying time trying to land here, unsuccessfully. Whilst they were going through all of these landing attempts, they executed it with an aircraft configuration of 25 degrees of flaps and a higher engine power setting. As a result, the plane was burning through more of their precious fuel, with just 2,200 pounds of fuel, or around 18 to 20 minutes of flying time remaining following the third missed approach, and their alternate was still over 100 miles away. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board, in cooperation with the McDonnell Douglas Company, they revealed that, theoretically, a diversion to their alternate in St. Thomas was still possible. Just barely. It would require perfect flying, and this was based on windless conditions making a straight shot for it, and this calculation could not take into consideration all of the other varying factors that could have impact on that flying time. It was an impossible task in such stormy and unpredictable conditions. Despite this, at 3:31, Captain DeWitt and his crew make a shot for it anyway. They abandon St. Maarten and attempt their diversion at St. Thomas. The tower controller hands them back over to San Juan Center. The crew believe they can make it. First Officer Harry Evans even runs a quick fuel check. He knows the plane left New York with 28,900 pounds of fuel, and according to the fuel usage indicators, which read around 13,150 pounds on each side, he deduced that they had around 2,600 pounds of fuel left on board, which was not exactly an accurate assessment. Factoring in the fuel used by the APU in New York and other miscellaneous factors, this brought the remaining fuel back down to the aforementioned 2,200 figure. The flight crew were, at least, confident that the plane had over 2,000 pounds of fuel remaining, a correct assumption at least. However, it still just wasn't enough. Captain DeWitt speaking to investigators, "My navigator and I were discussing it, and I told him that there was no way that we could possibly, at this particular time, no way in my judgment have less than 2,000 pounds of fuel on board this aircraft. The gauges had to be giving out some sort of erroneous reading." Let's talk about this erroneous reading. Whilst on the climb out, the fuel quantity indication began to sow doubt in the confidence of the crew, as it began to display erratic readings and even momentarily settled at a reading of just 850 pounds. This was a symptom of the extremely low fuel. You see, fuel quantity indication is measured by probes inside of the fuel tanks themselves. A pitching up of the nose with such a low fuel quantity, like during a missed approach, can cause the fuel still left in the tank to slosh about, meaning the probes can't get an accurate measurement, leading to these erratic fuel readings. This can actually have a more severe consequence in the form of a sudden flameout. If fuel cannot reach the fuel manifold due to being violently sloshed about, then that could lead to a sudden starvation of fuel. In the case of a missed approach with low fuel, pilots may execute a slow climb out at a shallow nose-up attitude for this reason. Flight 980, now committing to the diversion to St. Thomas, are now flying away from the St. Maarten Airport over the sea with a dangerously low fuel quantity. 3:33. It dawns on the flight crew that their fuel situation is already beyond desperate. They have been asked to maintain 4,000 feet due to crossing traffic, but Captain DeWitt gets on frequency to request higher. Anything you've got higher, I'm a little short on fuel and I've got to get up. Speaking here, the captain is likely thinking about the greater fuel efficiency at higher altitudes, but also thinking about how a higher altitude could be beneficial to glide on in the event of fuel exhaustion. Here he was, excessively burning away the remaining fuel at such a low altitude. He knows, either way, he needs to get up, and ATC does issue the flight with a new altitude of 12,000. The captain applies a small amount of thrust to slowly bring the plane into a climb. Though intended to be a fuel-saving measure, the slow climb was found to be less fuel efficient than a quick ascent would have been from a full power climb. More of their precious fuel is gone, and they were now down to less than 1,000 pounds. According to the investigation, this was, effectively, the final blow for any hope they had of reaching the safety of an airport. In response to low fuel pressure warnings, Captain DeWitt switches on the booster pumps and opens the crossfeed valves. All tanks are now feeding the engines with whatever they've got left. Conversation on the flight deck turns to the feasibility of even making it to St. Thomas, which is still a little over 90 miles away. Now, the Caribbean is full of airports of varying sizes. From Flight 980's position with their remaining fuel, their nearest airport was still St. Maarten, which they couldn't land at, and they really had not gotten very far either. The next closest airport would technically be Sabah, although if you know anything about Sabah Airport, you'll know it absolutely was not an option. Flight 980 is just 70 miles from St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands. It's 20 miles closer than St. Thomas, making this the logical diversion. But even as they were only midway through their climb to 12,000, the other option sprung into the mind of Captain Ballsy DeWitt. By the time I had gotten to 7,000 feet in the climb, and the navigator and I were trying to analyze the situation and also deciding on closer fields, etc., I decided that there was no way for me to discern whether the fuel gauge was accurate or inaccurate. I had to believe it. If at this time I did in fact have this low fuel, I would best get back on the water and try to find a place to ditch the aircraft. Captain DeWitt was met with a choice. If he continued to climb facing engine flameout, he could glide further on that altitude. Or whilst he still had the engines, he could choose a more controlled water landing. He needed to act quickly. Weighing up the consequences, he chooses the water and expresses this intention to San Juan Center. "Okay, there's a possibility I may have to ditch this aircraft," he says. "I am now descending to the water." Flight 980 was out of options. Due to fuel exhaustion, putting the plane on the water was all they had left. Moments later, the captain alerts the cabin. Because the cockpit public address system was inoperative, he could only flash a light to signal a cabin crew member to come to the flight deck. He summons the purser. Wilfred Spencer makes his way to the flight deck. Up till this point, no one in the cabin was really all too aware of the dire fuel situation. No doubt there may have been murmurs of fuel, especially amongst the cabin crew. The atmosphere amongst the passengers may have been one of nervousness, brought on by the nasty weather and diversion. Captain DeWitt informs Wilfred that he may have to put the plane on the water, and that the cabin should be prepared for a possible ditching. Standing there in the doorway of the cockpit, Wilfred Spencer took this to mean that ditching was only a possibility. He figured he'd receive further updates from the captain. To be clear, the situation at this point is that Flight 980 is going to hit the water, and perhaps clearer language between crew members should have been used to convey that. Still, Purser Wilfred Spencer re-enters the cabin to relay this with the other flight attendants. Together, the three of them begin the ditching procedures, getting passengers to don the life vests and performing the safety demonstrations using the cabin PA, which was working. Passengers were shown how to fasten and inflate the life vests. It's deeply unsettling to see, spurring chaos in the cabin. Some passengers struggle to retrieve theirs as they are secured tightly well beneath the seat. Others were left mystified as to how to open the packaging, let alone put them on. Even still, some passengers shrugged off the reality of the ditching, entrusting the pilots to get them to safety. There is deep confusion and concern, as there is no communication coming from the flight deck. No one else had been informed that the pilot's PA was inoperable. It is at this point that the navigator, Hugh Hart, emerges from the flight deck with a life vest. The captain had ordered him into the cabin to assist the flight attendants. He finds Tobias and Margaret performing the ditching safety demonstration and assisting passengers with their life vests. Wilfred is also attempting to secure the cabin, and had even been consoling a family with 2 children distraught by the situation. I need you to just try and put yourself into Wilfred's shoes for just a moment. Here he had 2 children, 2 little girls in front of him with life vests that were far too big for them. Wilfred Spencer had been taught that because children may be unable to do it themselves, he was taught to inflate the life vests of children and to tie the straps around their legs. The 2 little girls, unfortunately, would not make it out of the aircraft. It was a cavern of chaos in the cabin. There were passengers shielding themselves with pillows, other passengers were moving about the cabin, and others were just blankly staring out of the window into the stormy sky. The coat closet located in the forward cabin houses a life raft, one of 5 on board. The other 4 were stowed in the overhead bins near the overwing exits. Each of them can hold 25 people, so there should be enough room for everyone. However, due to the differences between ALM and ONA aircraft, just one of them would be prepared, the one that's in the coat closet. Other passengers will just have to make do with their life vests in the water. The flight attendants, with the help of the navigator, begin to prepare the life raft, bringing it into the galley in preparation for a swift launch onto the waves. This was all whilst some passengers are seemingly oblivious to the danger. 3:47. For several minutes, the flight crew had been taking the plane out west over the sea. The captain confirms on frequency that Flight 980 is going to be ditching on the water. With this news, the San Juan Center controllers immediately pick up the phone to inform the local Coast Guard that a passenger plane with 63 souls on board was about to go missing in the Caribbean Sea, somewhere between 30 to 50 miles from St. Croix. Up on the flight deck, Captain DeWitt knows the situation is bleak. He knows he's going to have to ditch the plane, but still has a sense of duty to get the plane as close as he can to St. Croix. A new San Juan controller suggests a return to St. Maarten, but even this is unrealistic now. Weather had not really improved there, and they were only about 1,000 feet in the air with hopelessly little fuel. Still, Navigator Hugh Hart has the cockpit door open as a crude method of communicating with the pilots. The captain brings the DC-9 down to just 500 feet above the water, and he sees the inevitable fate of the aircraft as the waves emerge into view. He flashes the seatbelt sign again, but no one in the cabin understands what to make of these chimes. The cabin crew, being from a different airline to the flight crew, never had the same training to discern emergency situations from these sign flashes and chimes. It wasn't something their airline did, and very few words have been exchanged between the cabin and cockpit. The ejected navigator, however, does know the impending danger behind such chimes. They prepare for the worst. With just moments to spare, Captain DeWitt and First Officer Evans have their eyes fixed to the window, looking for a suitable place to ditch. Ditching near a sea vessel could be beneficial, but there isn't one. They can barely see because of the low visibility, and once low enough to break free of the clouds, all they see is water. Any plane crash is exceedingly rare even back then, but performing a water landing in a passenger plane is almost unthinkable and is extremely difficult to do with several unique challenges. For example, our captain needs to align his plane parallel with the swelling of the waves for a more favorable water landing. The storm makes the wave swells large and unpredictable. Hitting a wave from the front may cause great damage. It requires delicate maneuvering from the captain to plant the plane on the back end of a wave. Impacting the water tail first may also bring its fair share of problems. Focusing stress at the tail could cause separation and a deluge of water to enter the fuselage. You can be conscious of all of the dangers associated with a forced water landing, but still, no one knows how the plane will behave in the ditching moment. Ballsy DeWitt, utilizing his thousands of hours of flight experience, gently lowers the DC-9 in increments: 400, 300, 200 feet. After each step, he takes a moment to catch his breath. He drops the plane down to just 100 feet above the water. The waves are tantalizingly close to the plane, splashing against the underside of the fuselage. Then, just whilst the plane was coasting at 100 feet, the lights on the aircraft begin to flicker. It's a sign that it's finally happening. The engines are being starved of fuel. The plane is giving up. The pilots lose electrical service to their instruments. Captain DeWitt switches over to the emergency power supply as the engines begin winding down. The passengers and flight attendants can hear the engines flaming out. Without the public address system, the captain can't warn the cabin to brace. Instead, he flashes the seatbelt sign 3 times in quick succession. In the cabin, navigator Hugh Hart could sense that they are seconds away from impact with the water. He shouts into the cabin for everyone to get down. Tobias takes position in the life raft. Wilfred plants himself in the jump seat. Margaret, up till this point, had been doing God's work in assisting passengers with their life vests. She was still in the aisle, making her way to her station in the back. On her way, she is pushing passengers back into their seats. This would, unfortunately, be the last time anyone ever saw her. Without engine power, the airspeed drops. Just a matter of meters above the waves, the DC-9 has now become a glider. The captain shifts his right hand to the throttle console and fully extends the flaps beyond normal operation to the emergency 50-degree maximum to try and yield as much lift as he possibly can from the wings. It creates a lot of drag, and the plane slows to below 100 knots. At 15:49, ALM Flight 980 hits the water. The plane is intact, at least mostly so. At first, the plane lay banked in the water at about 45 degrees. Dazed from the impact, the captain grabs the control wheel and levels the plane. Though in the water, the pilots still had a strange sense of slight control, and thus the plane is leveled neutral. Captain Ballsy DeWitt had managed to do the unthinkable, in that he landed his passenger plane on the water in a generally okay condition, all things considered, with the DC-9 bobbing about in the sea. However, it came at a cost. When the investigation team later studied the characteristics of the water landing, it was found the plane had come to a rest on the water in a distance shorter than the plane itself. The force of this far exceeded many of the structural elements of the cabin. Such a massive deceleration would not have been a pleasant experience for anyone on board. It's difficult to imagine, but consider for a moment that some passengers were either standing or had not fastened their seatbelts. Let's talk about the seatbelts really quick, because they weren't exactly like the ones we see today on airplanes. In fact, because of this accident, seatbelt construction was reviewed. Whereas today, plane seatbelts have a metal-to-metal construction that easily snaps together, the original DC-9s had a fabric-to-metal element, and these seatbelts could not restrain anywhere near as much force. So the forces created by the deceleration of the ditching far exceeded what the seatbelts and even the broader seating structure could withstand. Everything from passenger belongings to seating to galley supplies, and even the passengers themselves were thrown all over the cabin due to the force of the impact. It was a mess. It is uncertain just how many people fell victim to this initial ditching impact. Around 20 people at the very least were knocked unconscious, if they had not outright sustained a blunt, fatal blow. On the flight deck, it's a similar story. The pilots had been thrown forward from the deceleration, but were restrained thanks to their harnesses. They quickly found that though the aircraft is floating, water was immediately entering the plane. Passenger planes, even when they haven't been subject to a forceful ditching, are not perfect pressure containers and are not watertight. Suddenly, streams of water begin to penetrate the fuselage through any and all openings. Cracks in the windows, the buckling of the doors, the DC-9 is taking on water quickly and begins to sink. There is only minutes to act. Having survived the impact, the crew in the forward cabin knew they needed to begin the evacuation immediately, and could not wait for any orders from the captain. The DC-930 series has several exits. The forward left door is the main entry point on and off the plane. There is also a service door on the forward right. Then there are the two pairs of overwing exits. And at the back there is of course the rear staircase, a product of its time that allowed for aft entrance directly into the cabin aisle. The rear exit, for obvious reasons, would not be used in the evacuation, but there were problems with the other doors too. Wilfred Spencer and Hugh Hart immediately leap into action, taking aim at the forward left main exit. The other cabin crew member here, Tobias, goes for the door on the right. To their dismay, the navigator and purser struggle with the main exit. Not only is water pouring in through the cracks of the door, but it appears to be jammed. There could be several reasons for this. It is entirely possible that the opening mechanism of the door could have become misshapen, deformed in the impact, making it difficult or impossible to release the door. Tobias, on the other hand, is able to free the right service entrance. As you can then imagine, the three of them scramble to try and get the life raft into the sea. One passenger immediately flings themselves through the opening of the door into the water. However, because on ditching, the cabin and galley was so greatly devastated with equipment and stuff being flung all over the place, this makes it even tougher to handle the raft, which suddenly inflates, unintentionally so, inside of the aircraft, blocking the galley and entrance to the flight deck. With so little time, it's a frustrating turn of events. As it turns out though, another flotation device was already floating out in the water. The emergency slide from the door had detached, and was still contained in its packaging as it floated on the water. Towards the rear of the cabin, passengers are without a cabin crew member to look to for direction. Margaret Abraham was nowhere to be seen. She was either knocked unconscious in the ditching or was killed as a result of it. Either way, the surviving passengers back here are on their own to open the overwing exits. On the flight deck, the two pilots still inside unfasten themselves from their seats to assist in the evacuation. First Officer Harry Evans becomes stuck in the galley from the unintentionally inflated life raft. Captain DeWitt is still inside the cockpit. The navigator and cabin crew in the forward cabin set about freeing the frozen first officer, which they managed with a lot of squeezing. Together, the four of them proceeded to squeeze themselves through the raft to make it outside, evacuating via the forward right service exit. The first officer was without a life vest. In the water, he tries clinging onto whatever he can find. Drifting around the back, he holds onto the plane's tail for support. Hugh, in a stroke of luck, once he was in the water, found the detached emergency slide. He inflates it, so there is at least something for survivors to hold onto. Captain DeWitt is the last crew member to escape the sinking plane. Knowing the cockpit to cabin entrance is blocked by the unintentionally inflated life raft, his only option is a window exit. All passenger planes have at least one window that can be opened with a handle inside of the cockpit. Ballsy opens the window on his side and escapes into the sea below, before then swimming around to the left wing, where he finds that neither of the overwing exits on that side had been opened. Passengers were instead escaping on the other side. Climbing onto the wing, he was able to open the aft left overwing door from the outside. He re-enters and assists two passengers who had been left dazed by the initial impact. He helps them both outside via the right overwings. He re-enters the plane one last time as a final quick check for more passengers. From Ballsy's position scanning about the cabin, now dark and filling with water, it looked like that was the last of them. Captain DeWitt finally saves his own life and leaves. He was one of the last people to leave Flight 980. Water was now pouring into the plane, the DC-9 listing to the right. However, only a little over 40 people had escaped the plane, so despite the captain's efforts, there were nearly 24 people still on board the aircraft. Most had probably been made unconscious from the impact. They would have been either still in their seat or flung to other parts of the cabin. This leaves open the rather awful possibility that several passengers drowned unconsciously, or either woke up too late and weren't able to save themselves. The last person to leave the sinking plane is 56-year-old Jeannie Larmany. She was made unconscious when the plane hit the water. Originally sat in 16A, her seat was ripped from its fitting, and she had been flung 10 rows ahead up to row 6. She wakes up in a daze to the sound of rushing water. She looks around to find that she appears to be alone. Mrs. Larmony was a gifted swimmer. She was in very good shape for her age and was able to save herself despite the water now being up to her neck as she swam towards the overwing exit. It is, frankly, incredible that she survived and was able to tell her story. Outside, passengers and crew had begun to climb onto the detached emergency slide. Others clung to whatever they could find. There were a few landing gear tires that had escaped from the shattered cargo compartment. Some clung to those and other pieces of debris. The plane drifted beneath the waterline, so only the uppermost part of the tail fin was left. Harry Evans, the first officer without a life vest, was resting on the horizontal stabilizer. He re-enters the water to assist a passenger where he can feel the undertow current from the sinking jet. Together, around 43 survivors watch in stunned disbelief as to what they were seeing. They watched as the final plunge pulled the plane beneath the water. Forever. Never to be seen again. The wreckage would not be raised in the investigation. It didn't need to be. The remains of Flight 980 lay at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea to this day. Floating on the surface of the water, survivors were left awaiting the arrival of Coast Guard rescue teams. The Caribbean Sea is a warm sea, or at the very least is warmer than most. Hypothermia was not an immediate risk to life. Though, as sources do tend to point out, the Caribbean Sea is home to various forms of life that some are quick to mention includes sharks. The fear of sharks in the water was shared amongst the passengers, many of whom, being locals to the Caribbean, are all too aware of the fact that sharks and jellyfish inhabit these waters. Some time passed before the first aircraft arrived at the scene. It was a Pan Am Boeing 727 that had been notified of the missing plane. They went to go look for it, making a low pass over the site. By the time it had arrived, the DC-9 was already gone beneath the waves. The Pan Am crew only spotted survivors in the water and an oil slick where the plane once was. They report the position to ATC, and rescue teams are notified. Several aircraft would be involved in the operation. An Antilles airboat's Grumman Goose was the next to arrive. It's an amphibious aircraft, a passenger seaplane. Though the crew of the Goose expressed intentions to land on the sea, the water was deemed to be too rough for a landing. They stayed with the survivors, circling overhead the emergency slide until further help arrived. A Shorts Skyvan had also been dispatched. The small propeller plane could get low and slow down over the site. It features a large loading door at the back, and with life rafts aboard, they released them to the survivors in the water. Though the rafts landed some 30 to 50 meters away, Captain Ballsy DeWitt and Navigator Hugh Hart leap back into the sea to try and retrieve them. However, they would fail to return with either of the rafts. First Officer Harry Evans stays with the main group of survivors, and his efforts in aiding passengers in the rescue would be duly recognized. A second amphibious plane arrives, a Coast Guard Grumman HU-16 Albatross. It's a plane that would stay close by and help coordinate the rescue circling overhead. But they too couldn't land on the sea to assist. When the multiple US Navy and Coast Guard helicopters did arrive, one of the first people to be hoisted from the sea was Captain DeWitt. The captain was able to assist rescue teams in the aircraft, providing critical information on the state of the situation. One by one, passengers and crew members were pulled from the sea, some with more difficulty than others. Overweight from a heavy load of passengers, helicopters transported the survivors to the nearest land in St. Croix. At sunset, First Officer Harry Evans was the last to be rescued. Though survivors would recall seeing around 43 initial survivors, only 41 were pulled from the water that day alive. Another passenger sadly passed away upon arrival at the hospital in St. Croix. 63 people were on board Flight 980. A total of 23 perished. The investigation, led by the National Transportation Safety Board, found several factors relating to the accident: poor weather, poor communication between the ground and the flight, and an ill-prepared cabin strategy. However, investigators concluded that the accident was, of course, caused by fuel exhaustion, not necessarily brought on by the increased fuel consumption en route to the Caribbean, but rather fuel exhaustion here was a symptom of the decision to continuously attempt an arrival into St. Maarten. The board determines that the probable cause of this accident was fuel exhaustion, which resulted from continued unsuccessful attempts to land in St. Maarten until insufficient fuel remained to reach an alternate airport. A contributing factor was the reduced visibility in the approach zone because of rain showers, a condition not reported to the flight. The board also finds that the probability of survival would have been increased substantially if there had been better crew coordination prior to and during the ditching. Though pilot error was pinned as the cause of the accident, investigators did recognize that the flying skill displayed by Captain Ballsy DeWitt was, to be clear, incredible. Credit where it is due and all that, Captain DeWitt demonstrated excellent airmanship in ditching the plane on water in stormy conditions, doing so keeping the DC-9 essentially intact. Of course, nothing could be done about the sinking or how the water behaved, but on a pure flying note, his skill was excellent, even if the decision-making of the flight crew prior to the ditching was questionable. The captain's actions post-ditching were also recognized by survivors. Ballsy did what he could to help those in the water. Although this did not stop him from losing his job. In fact, Overseas National Airways fired all 3 of the flight crew members following the accident. Captain DeWitt never flew again. It has been known that Mr. DeWitt, throughout his remaining life, accepted full responsibility for what happened from the very beginning. It was something he lived with for the rest of his life. The investigation issued several safety recommendations. Among them was to highlight the importance of an operational public address system for the cockpit. It had not been fixed before the accident flight, and caused communication issues between the flight deck and cabin. Planes today cannot be dispatched without a fully operational PA, or at the very least, not without establishing an alternative. Passenger seating, including the seat belts and the seats themselves, were to be examined and reviewed. The investigation recommending the metal-to-metal seatbelt constructions we see today, with calls to eliminate the old fabric ones. The passenger seats themselves these days can withstand much greater forces, though the older seats lingered on older aircraft for many years after, something which contributed to further loss of life in other accidents. ONA, the airline operating the plane on behalf of ALM, did not get out of this unscathed. You see, there were some pre-existing issues with getting this flight, the New York to St. Maarten route, off the ground in the first place. The Federal Aviation Administration had expressed concerns and originally quashed the direct route, exclaiming it required a stopover in the Bahamas if operated by a DC-9. The plane's manufacturer had conveniently dropped in with new 2-engine overwater procedures that satisfied the FAA, meaning that ONA could safely pull off the direct route, either by using strict fuel estimates or by necessitating a stopover en route in Bermuda if those fuel estimates could not be reached. We must appreciate and remind ourselves that this journey between New York and St. Maarten was barely within the range limits of the DC-9. It's a flight the plane can perform and even conform to fuel regulations in the process, but only just. To satisfy all parties involved, the FAA, the Civil Aeronautics Board, pilots' unions, and ALM Antillean Airlines, of course, ONA had planned to install an auxiliary fuel tank on the aircraft about a month or 2 before the accident, but plans fell through. Supposedly, this was due to ONA deferring its installation, because this would mean removing the plane from service for about 2 weeks to complete the work. For ONA, this was really the only plane they could offer for the journey. The airline did also fly the larger DC-8, but there were other complications with bringing it onto the route. The runway in St. Maarten was too short for a DC-8 at the time. This left the airline operating this one plane that could barely fly the route non-stop, but they were caught in a bit of an economic rut. You see, the flight already operated close to the edge of financial viability. If they pulled the plane from service to fit the additional fuel tank, then it couldn't fly and make them any money. So a decision was made to delay the installation of the fuel tank to some unspecified time in July or August, when demand for the route was lighter. Flight 980 had already taken on the maximum fuel load. If the additional tank was installed onto the plane and the same course of events unfolded, Flight 980 would have made it to the safety of an airport. It just goes to show that air disasters have layers to them. Foundations set by economic factors came at odds with nasty weather, pilot error, and an ill-prepared cabin, manifesting in one of the most extraordinary plane crashes in aviation history. I'd like to recognize the work of independent writer and journalist Emilio Corsetti and his book titled 35 Miles from Shore. I grabbed the audiobook version. I couldn't find a physical copy that wouldn't take forever to get to me. It is the most detailed work surrounding Flight 980 that has ever been produced. If there is anyone who knows the most about this accident, it's probably Emilio. It's much more detailed than my video, so you should absolutely seek it out if you'd like to learn more than we have discussed today. I'd like to thank Mr. Corsetti for his journalism and contribution to the conversation about Flight 980. Overseas National Airways continued to operate for 8 years following the accident. They still found some success in the charter business for a while, even investing in the wide-body McDonnell Douglas DC-10. However, financial difficulties set in throughout the 1970s, until the charter business ceased operations in 1978. In a dark, coincidental twist of events, one of ONA's new DC-10s, November 1034 Foxtrot, was redelivered to our old friend Spantax Airlines of Spain, who bought the plane outright from them during their liquidation. That plane, re-registered as Echo Charlie Delta Echo Golf, operated for about 7 years at Spantax, until it was involved in a shocking accident in Malaga, Spain, where it crashed a Spantax Flight 995. If you'd like to learn more about that accident, we already have a video on it. Going back to Flight 980 for just a second, there are many curious details about this flight that don't pertain to the accident and how it unfolded. However, if one is to believe the lore behind this aircraft, then there may still be some extraordinary artifacts still lurking inside of the ruins of this plane. As we established earlier, the wreckage of the plane has never been salvaged. The DC-9 drifted beneath the water, and where it sank is where it has stayed to this day, completely untouched. As far as I know anyway. Amongst the many curious artifacts believed to still be inside the wreckage are a set of cameras belonging to 2 passengers who got up from their seats and began taking pictures. We don't really know why, but it has been speculated that they had planned to sell images of the accident to the media. The 2 cameras containing the undeveloped film were left inside the cabin and went down with the plane. If we're being honest, this film is probably long destroyed, having spent over 50 years in the sea. Though such photographs would have given us extraordinary insight as to what was going on in the cabin just before the landing on the water. One wealthy passenger apparently lost their entire jewelry collection in the sinking, the collection itself totaling upwards of $100,000. Another passenger, a sketchy Caribbean real estate developer, is supposed to have stuffed over $300,000 into his briefcase, which supposedly was to be used to close an under-the-table deal on a new resort in St. Maarten. Chat, is this real? The briefcase was apparently left under his seat in row 1, and also went down with the plane. This leaves more questions unanswered, but let's remind ourselves that we have our answers as to what happened. So, despite any curiosities inside of the wreckage, maybe we should just leave it alone. The deeper mysteries surrounding Flight 980 remain to this day under the sea. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you all taking the time to watch these videos, and if you enjoyed this one, be sure to leave a like on your way out. I know I mentioned it in the video itself, but I will leave a link to 35 Miles from Shore by Emilio Corsetti in the description of this video, if you'd like to check it out for yourself. So, yeah, when I first started reading up on this accident, I kind of didn't really know what to expect going in with this one. I promise you, I had planned on a shorter video considering the last one was nearly 2 hours, but oops, here we are at the 1 hour mark, so I guess there's that. I promise the next one will not be as far away. It can't be. It can't. I know what the next video is, and I'm just here thinking, ain't no way it can be as long, right? But I guess we'll find out. Anyway, it is that time where I must take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their incredible and generous support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you see your name here, a massive thanks to you. I don't like to do sponsors all that much. I like to think I have a standard for any sponsor I do, and though I get inundated with emails all of the time, I don't really take them up on it unless I'm confident with them. So Patreon support is always much appreciated. We have a bunch of shoutouts to get through this time, and we'll begin with the business class tier, in order of which they joined. A big thank you to Annette Offner, Bogey Centuri, Nick, Black Forest Wolf, Salvador Garcia, Josephine, and Nabatobi. And of course, the first class tier patrons with their truly generous support. A big thank you to Whiskey Tech Fred, Albert Watson, Jack O'Neill, Sean Smith, Bo Lewis, Toonie16, Nangar, and Z Watt, who actually increased their pledge just this morning when I'm recording this. What absolute legends. Thank you all so much. I believe I got everyone here. A quick word to patrons though, if I do miss you or if you change your name or anything, please do message me on there and I will make amendments to the end screen and stuff. I think that is going to be it from me today, and I am going to firmly shut the hell up now. If you do want to follow me on my socials, the links to those will also be in the pinned comment and description. That's all from me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye!